You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, this is Pete Betke of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. Today is Friday, February 26, 2016, and I have as my guest today Bruce Caldwell. Bruce is a research professor and director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. For the past 2 decades, his research has focused on the multifaceted writings of the Nobel Prize-winning economist and social theorist F.A. Hayek. Welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
Let's start out, Bruce, with just a sort of a basic question about, what are you currently working on, and also maybe some of the efforts that you're doing at the center at Duke to advance history of economic thought within the profession. But
okay, I could talk for a long time about both of those topics. I'll take up what I'm currently working on first. I started work on a family authorized biography of Friedrich Hayek. So what does that mean? I am still the general editor of the book series, The Collected Works of F.A. Hayek. I took that over from Stephen Kresge, who took it over from Bill Bartley. And there's only 2 volumes that are still outstanding. One is in press, and then 2 others still outstanding. And it was always the intention when they started the Collected Works series that the general editor would do a full biography of Hayek. And the idea was, after having done all of the editing of all those volumes, that you'd be in a good position to actually talk about his contributions, over his lifetime. About 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, I got with the remaining members of the Hayek family. That's Hayek's daughter, Christine, and now Eska Hayek, who is Larry Hayek's widow. So he had 2 children with his first wife, none with his second wife. And we started thinking about how to execute that. And they were good enough to offer me the family correspondence that was existent, that no one else has seen before. So that was all brand new material. There were letters from Hayek's mother to him from his youth, also through World War I. And then in the 1920s, they lived in Vienna, so a little less then, but whenever he'd travel. And then after he moved to London and then Chicago, letters about once every 3 weeks, 4 weeks or so. All in German. She wrote in a old italic style that was very difficult to find someone who was able to translate it. And what I ended up doing is having a master's student who spoke German, who had a stepfather who read the old-time German, and he would do the translation, rough translation of her letters, and then the student would do another translation from the regular German into English. And it was more to just get a sense of what was going on in the letters. If there are specific letters that look like they're going to be very interesting, we'll have someone else make sure the translation is accurate. But the process has been that for about the first 3 years of this project, I was gathering information. I have a co-author, Hans-Jörg Klausinger, who's at the University of Vienna, a university in Vienna. It's not the University of Vienna that Hayek was at, but it was kind of a business, Vienna School of Business and Economics, something like that. But he's a great historian of economic thought. That's his field. In monetary, which is an area that I'm less well versed in. Plus, he obviously has German as his first language, so he has been doing all sorts of research in archives in Vienna, He's gone to Freiburg. He's gone to some of the places that Hayek would go to, like Obergurgl and other places, gathering documents, information. Particularly, he would understand how a university system in a German language country would work, so where to go to find the documents and all the rest. So while he's been working on that end, I've been working on kind of the family life end. And for the first, as I was going to say, for the first 3 years, it was mostly gathering the information to see what things we had before we started executing the writing. And we're just in the last year and a half, we've started to begin the writing up work. So I've recently done a chapter on Hayek's living in England, living in a particular neighborhood in England, what it was like for his kids. I went to that neighborhood with his daughter, Christine. I have about 25 hours of interviews with her. She told me about where she lived, where Lionel Robbins lived, what life was like there. I went through and went through the translations of letters of his correspondence with his family, his two brothers, both of whom were in Germany, and his mother, who was in Vienna during the 1930s, which is a very fraught time. Fascinating documents, and they were politically they were nationalistic, they good countrymen, so they had lots of political disagreements and difficulties. Even though this is one aspect of the correspondence, it's a bit frustrating. The letters from them Hayek kept, but they didn't keep his letters. So I've had to try to piece together what I thought the conversations were in these letters from their reactions to things that he would have said in his letters. But you can still get a very, very strong sense that they disagreed politically about lots of things.
It's an amazing, rich history, right, of what they went through in the 20th century and the sort of from World War I to, through World War II. The personal relationship aspects of things, like with Robbins, it's kind of a tough thing to reconstruct at some level, because since they worked close together, is there much of an archival record, or did they just talk to each other rather than leaving it in a kind of a written record?
So the written record is actually, there's some letters of interest just before Hayek came there permanently. So he came and gave the Prices in Production lectures. So there was some correspondence back and forth before and after that. And then he was invited for a year as an acting in an acting position, but then a visiting position was the term that was used. But then about halfway through that, they made him the permanent position offer. So just before his trip to give the lectures, after the trip to give the lectures, and then in the summer before he arrived for the first year that he was there, there's some correspondence. After that, it is really, really spotty. About the only stuff had to do with where Lionel was helping him with his English on some of the things that he was publishing. He really gave a lot of help with the Prices in Production lecture, for example. So there are some documents, but not really correspondence. And then after that, very spotty, because as you said, they're seeing each other every day, so they're not corresponding. And once the time that they're separated, which is during World War II, and Robbins is doing government work in London, Hayek is up in Cambridge because the LSE evacuated to Cambridge. There's not anything because Lionel is doing government work, so he's really not supposed to be communicating with people. There was really kind of a cutoff there. And after Hayek went to the States, they had a falling out because it occurred at the same time as Hayek's divorce, and Robbins was quite upset about that. There's a long story there too. Yeah. So there wasn't really much. There really not very much correspondence between the two of them.
I'm very fascinated. I'm wondering if you have any insights on this, which is that because of the work of Stefan Bohm and others, we have a kind of an idea and nostalgic remembrance of the seminar in Vienna that was Morgenstern and Hayek and Machlup and Schutz and all of them around Mises. And in the interviews with Alchin, Hayek talks about the wonderful seminar that he and Robbins ran. And Robbins refers in some places about the wonderful seminar, but it's hard to reconstruct in the same way that you do the Vienna seminar or the way you would do today. Like if I went to the Center for History of Political Economy and wanted to look up who you've had in for the last several years, there would be a record because of the internet, and we keep these records on the web now. But it's finding out the content that was discussed and the kind of ideas that was being developed in the Robbins Hayek seminar seemed to me kind of amazing, because the LSE became this amazing in the 30s, this tremendous hotbed of intellectual ideas in economics.
Yeah, I've just right now, because I'm working on a chapter on Hayek in Cambridge, which is right after the 1930s period. So I'm looking at a lot of his reminiscences, and he said that his period at the LSE in the 1930s was one of the most intellectually stimulating in terms of the economics. And he said, he learned a huge amount from his colleagues, particularly in the Robbins Hayek seminar. So Sue Howson has done a biography of Robbins that is really meticulous work, wonderful, wonderful book. And she would know where, if there were materials that would specify exactly what the topics were. But I think you're right. What we would know is the time of day that the seminar was, but not necessarily the specific papers that were given. And the only way you'd be able to construct that, and it would be a partial reconstruction, would be looking at some of the correspondence, and then if night had come through, for example, there would be some indication of him having visited that day or something like that.
Now you have written, obviously, another earlier major book on Hayek's Challenge, which is more of an intellectual biography, the evolution of his ideas and whatnot over his long career and in the various different disciplines. And you've been the editor of the collected works. What were some of the biggest challenges besides, as you say out in the beginning of Hayek's Challenge, the problem was the challenge of Hayek is that he's in all these different disciplines and his career spans 7 decades or whatever it is. But what are some of the other challenges and exciting challenges that you've come across, both in doing finishing up the Collected Works project as well as this biography that you're working on now?
Really different challenges in the two different projects. The Collected Works, when I took it over from Stephen Kresge, there was no money. That is
always a challenge.
and you need money if you're going to try to convince people to become volume editors and actually get their work done. And even with the money that we were able to pay honoraria to the individual volume editors, some of them took a really long time. Now, in the end, if it's a quality product, which I think the volumes have been, that is okay. And if it takes a long time to do something, some people work more quickly than others. Sandy Peart did a wonderful, beautiful volume on John Stuart Mill, Hayek's writings on John Stuart Mill. But she took over the project, and then she became this dean at the University of Richmond, which, as anyone who's done administrative work knows, that's a big bite to bite off. So she took a little longer, but the volume is just superb. So, and I had to raise money to support that. And ultimately, what ended up happening after many false starts was that I was able to get Liberty Fund and the University of Chicago Press to work together so that Liberty Fund would produce their very beautiful and high-quality paperback editions of the volumes in the Collected Works, and in exchange for that would provide me with funds that I could use to pay honoraria to the volume editors, and also sometimes I would need funds for translations or things like that, or getting rights for things that Hayek published in places that you have to pay to to reproduce it. So that has been, once that was put into place, things really went very smoothly after that.
The two, just to clarify, you said there's two remaining volumes. Those are Law, Legislation, and Liberty.
That's
and
right.
Is the Sensory Order one? Or?
The Sensory Order is in press.
In press.
Victor Van Berg is the volume editor for that one, and it will include the Sensory Order. And most of the volumes also include materials that are related that may not have been published. So the Sensory Order volume will also include a translation of Hayek's original 1920 student essay that gave rise to some of the ideas in the Sensory Order, as well as about systems and within systems and about systems. This unfinished essay that he wrote in the 1950s after he published the Sensory Order that was an attempt to move beyond some of the claims in the Sensory Order to, I think, a kind of a causal model that he was never able to accomplish. There were many things that Hayek wanted to do that he wasn't able to do, but all of them are a testament to the fertility of his mind that he was even attempting.
Yes, I'm very fascinated to see Victor's. I haven't read any of the stuff associated with Victor's stuff, but Victor's teacher was a man named Hans Albert. And Hans Albert accused neoclassical economics of what he called model Platonism. And in that essay, he has a great line, which he says that neoclassical economics will never be able to repair its institutional deficiency until it repairs its behavioral deficiency. So his argument was that the standard neoclassical model was built on a wrong psychological foundations. And this has led to Victor then working on rule-following behavior. So I'm kind of fascinated to see how Victor negotiates this in the interview, because Victor's work, to a large extent, was always more institutional, but yet it's built on this idea of rule-following behavior, which comes out of his studies with Hans Albert early on. And so I'm kind of intrigued by how what he has to say about what we do with the Sensory Order and what we learn from it. Yeah.
And so we had a bit of a negotiation. Part of the responsibility of the general editor is to try to help shape the editorial introductions. And my way of trying to do that, and I wasn't always successful, but my goal was that rather than have someone provide an interpretive essay of what was going on in the volume, rather than do that, create the historical understanding of the place the work within the context in which it was created. That's a very different sort of approach from offering an assessment of what the work means.
Yeah.
And I said, you'll be able to do that. I would tell editors, you'd be able to do that after you've done the editing of the volume, but do it in a journal article or a monograph or something like that, because it's more. We want these things to stand the test of time, and the best way to have them stand the test of time is not to offer a specific interpretation, but rather just tell us where the thing came from, and then let other people do the work of interpretation subsequently.
Yeah, that's the appropriate scholarly approach to those things, I think. Yeah.
Well, it's the one that I settled on. I'm an historian of economics, so that's the approach I would naturally take. Yeah. But it's been a real learning process, because I wasn't good at trying to figure out how to raise money. I'm an academic, but I had to try to figure out a way to get the project to be able to move along, and it is interesting to deal with academics. The herding cats metaphor does sometimes come to mind. Since some of the days when I felt like things weren't moving forward, but now that it's almost done, I mean, I'm very proud of the work that the individual editors have done. And I did a few of the volumes myself, and I really enjoyed doing that, because to do that kind of historical context providing, you just dive in and read all this stuff that was being written by Hayek, but also the people he was responding to at the time period, and you really immerse yourself in a particular period of time, and it's fun. I mean, it's something that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed when you first did the sort of volumes, and then setting up into your book, discussing sort of Walter Rathenau and all of the sort of context of the times of which Hayek grew up as a young economist, thinking about these issues associated with basically planning and the way that you organize an economy and whatnot. Was there any particular challenges in addition to the challenge that you had from the first book, which is just that Hayek wrote for 7 decades and across all these fields, that you're now feeling pinched with this particular volume?
So the book that I'm working on now will attempt to give an overview, not in the sort of detail that would have happened in each of the individual volumes in the collected works, but an overview of his intellectual contributions. But again, also a lot about him as a person, his life, his family. So it's going to be an attempt to meld those things together. And you really are, I'm constantly shifting gears in trying to do something like that. And it is more difficult to write about a person and his family. I almost feel like I'm prying when I ask Christine questions about her father and their relationship and how did the mother do with the divorce. And yeah, these are things that most people don't like talking about, and particularly when you're dealing with a elderly British lady. Yeah, it took me a while to start, but luckily she's very forthcoming and just a wonderful person. Very, very, just a great person. Really I've enjoyed my relationship with Christine Hayek. So trying to blend together an intellectual history, make coherent sense out of his contributions, without imposing any overarching structure on it. But you always want to be able to do that to tell a story. And you have to take it, at the end of the day, you have to express opinions about the thing that you're looking at, the person you're looking at. So how to bring all that together, still haven't done it. And plus you have a co-author. Yeah. So there are other things that's still ahead.
So one last question about the biography, which is, in many ways, I think one of the most interesting biographies is Skidelsky's biographies on Keynes, because Keynes is just this. You read them and you'd want to go have a beer with Keynes, right? And sit down and talk just to meet him, because the communication, no matter how much you disagree with him, the communication of him as a person is that he's this dynamic personality, attractive personality that, you're drawn to. What's Hayek like? I mean, I never met him. I've only seen him on video at a very, very advanced age. In his prime, was he? It seems like he must have been charismatic, because he could hardly speak the language, and yet the story is that people were attracted to his ideas and whatnot, and just a little bit of sense of that now that you've studied the man for so long.
So he is an impressive figure. A flawed figure, certainly, in terms of modern sensibilities about what a family man should be. He was very much a man of his own generation and class. So his vision of what a good wife should do is to support the husband in whatever the husband's endeavors were, and make it so that he could accomplish what he needed to accomplish. He was like many of his colleagues, particularly in England. You have the image of the children appearing in their best clothes at 6 p.m. and then going off at 6:45, and that's it. They show up at tea time. Now, Christine said it wasn't quite like that, but he would have really liked it if it had been. That sort of thing. So, I mean, his that aspect of his personality would be, I think, quite difficult for somebody like people of our generation who are not used to having quite that kind of separation between the parents and the children, and the role of the wife and all of that. He seemed to be somebody who was very well liked, a man's man in that sense, gregarious, engaging, interested in what other people had to say. I've heard this over and over again by people who have met him in ways that were brief, but he would always try to be engaged with people. If I think about people like Ludwig Lockman, I would think he was probably somewhat like that in terms of his personality. And I love my interactions with Lockman. Intellectual, always wanting to engage ideas. I met a man with whom he was spent 2 weeks in South Africa after doing a bunch of professional work. They went out to Kruger National Park, and they lived in these little huts. It was Hayek and his wife, and this man and his wife. And they would go out at 6 in the morning when the gates opened. They would drive around Kruger National Park looking at big game, and then come back to the huts at 5 when they locked the gates. And then they would spend. He said he would spend the evening with Hayek till midnight every night. Just do it for 2 weeks. This is when he's in his 70s. I mean, he was really in good physical condition, very robust. And he said that Hayek was not one for small talk. His mind was always working. He's not going to sit around and do chit chat. And if, for example, the wives might comment on the decor in a restaurant or something like that, he would be very polite, quietly fold his hands, but just not say anything, and until it got back to a conversation that was about something, in his view, substantial. So he was very much an academic figure. He worked very hard. He worked incredibly hard. The amount of stuff that he wrote. Now, Keynes, he was very impressed with. Hayek was very impressed with Keynes. He talked about his bewitching voice, his wonderful conversationalist. He said that Keynes and Schumpeter were the two people that if he were ever, if he had the chance to have a dinner with, he said those were the two that he would most want to, just because of their glittering conversation. Just phenomenal people to engage with. But I think he was someone who certainly was an intellect in perhaps a bit more austere way. His appreciation of Keynes was that Keynes was essentially, in Hayek's view, an aesthete. And I think that Hayek was essentially a scientist, viewed himself as a scientist. He came from a family of scientists, and that was his way of approaching the world.
Right. Let's move away from your current research and more towards the institution building aspect of your career that you've also taken on at the same time that you've taken on these other projects, which is building the center at Duke and the programs that you've involved in. Talk a little bit about that and what motivates that initiative and how you feel it's going and whatnot.
Okay, so I'm the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke. And the mission of the center is to promote and support research in and the teaching of the history of economic thought. The reason why I went to Duke from UNC Greensboro, which is where I spent the largest part of my academic life, was that history of thought is not doing well in the economics profession as people are retiring. They're not being replaced. So I wanted to at least push against that trend. Duke has had a long history as being a place that supported the history of economic thought. Crawford Goodwin, Neil DeMarchi, and Roy Weintraub have been there for years, but even before them there were people like J.J. Spangler and Calvin Hoover. So that it had a long tradition. The major journal in the field, History of Political Economy, is published there. They have an archival collection, which is probably I think it's probably the best in the world in terms of economist papers. More than a dozen Nobel Prize winners' papers are there. Hayek's papers are there in microfilm, but Paul Samuelson, Ken Arrow, the list goes to 12. Vernon Smith and Doug North being two that are more closer to the Austrian movement. So variety of different sorts of people. The papers for the American Economic Association, Karl Manger's papers are there. Oscar Morgenstern's papers are there. Don Patinkin.
It's an amazing collection.
It's a great list. Yeah, it's a great list. So people had thought of Duke as a place to come for history of economic thought. And what the center does is just to add a few more dimensions because we have a fellowship program, so that allows people to come who are either in the last year finishing up their doctorate or postdocs or mid-career people working on a project in the history of economics. They come to Duke either for a semester or an academic year. We provide them with a stipend if they need it. If they are mid-career and they have a sabbatical, they can just come on their own. We have a different community each year, and we do try to build a community. We have a lunch every week. Sometimes the lunch is just to discuss whatever anyone wants to. Other times it's discussing work in progress. About every couple of weeks we have a workshop, often with an outside speaker. We've had one-day conferences, and we have an annual conference in April, which is affiliated with the journal History of Political Economy that is usually 2 or 3 years in the making, where there's a theme for that conference. The papers are written expressly for the conference and then appear in a conference volume afterwards. So that's one aspect of what the center does to promote research. The fellowship program primarily does that. Then for trying to attract people to think about teaching the history of economics, we have a summer institute. Sometimes we can think of that as also stimulating research, but it's mostly to introduce people to the history of economics, particularly grad students from universities where the history of economic thought is not taught. If I'm at Harvard or Yale or virtually any of these big name schools, right on down to much smaller places, very few have history of economic thought at the graduate level. So students can't take it. And we have them in for a 2-week period. And sometimes we've done a kind of a boot camp sort of survey course in the history of economics. And while we're telling them about what Adam Smith and Malthus and Marx said, we also say, here's how I would present it in class. Here's different approaches to it. We usually have 2 or 3 faculty members who are doing in the room doing the teaching, so we might have it going back and forth. One of the most productive ones actually was the first one when it was Wade Hand, Steve Medema, and myself, and all 3 of us had taught undergraduate survey of history of thought courses, so each of us had different ideas about how to approach it. And we just simply try to introduce students to some of the great books. It's basically a great books course when we do it that way. Other times it's more 20th century history of thought. Kevin Hoover has a little macro section. Steve Medema has taken his The Hesitant Hand, which is about welfare economics, Coase theorem, that kind of stuff, and boiled it down to a manageable number of lectures. So we're just plugging away a little bit at a time. Whether or not it's going to have any impact, we won't know until this generation kind of moves along and see whether people are interested in it. But I think we're doing a really creditable job at what we're trying to do. People who come really, I think, profit from their time there. Many of the people who have come have been Europeans, or particularly for the fellowship program, but some of them gone on to some very good jobs afterwards. Yeah, so it is something that is for the very small number of places that are looking for someone who can do it. History of economics, having gone through one of the Duke programs is certainly something that is helpful for them.
Well,
it's been our experience.
I know people that I've run into uniformly just think the world of it. I have had, through a variety of circumstances, a chance to interact with a young scholar who's in religious studies, and she's studying the history of how the church's attitude towards markets. Her name is Christina McCory, and she's just a phenomenal scholar. And she had a great, 5 flybacks this last year, for jobs, which in religious studies is not, the biggest deal. But she was a student in your programs down there and just thought the world of it and spoke very highly of it. When you were talking earlier today, you mentioned interaction between individuals and ideas and historical circumstances, but also groups or discourse communities. We're now starting to pay more attention to the importance of these discourse communities within the culture of science. That's a broader project, I guess, that the people at Hope had a conference about and whatnot. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe the way that you're trying to create that discourse community among a new generation of people interested in history of economic ideas.
Sure. So some of the people who have come to our center over the past few years and will be coming are people who are not trained as economists, but who are very interested in how economics has interacted with other elements of the culture or society and how to tell that story. So the history of capitalism is kind of a big thing
topic
now.
These days,
Yeah. And historians are taking it on. So one of the people, but also sociologists and anthropologists. So two people that are one has been at the center and another one who is coming to the center. The anthropologist was studying Soviet economists from the 50s through today, and looking at the various groups and how they interacted with each other and the dynamics of power shifts at various points in time, the planners who were using input-output versus those who wanted to know how a market works versus those who wanted to be somewhere in between. So, I mean, it was a...
I'd be fascinated by this.
And this person is someone who had been to Russia for a couple of years, interviewing all of these people, picked up Russian on his own. Just a fascinating anthropological study of this particular tribe or extended tribe. Then there's a sociologist who's looking at the concept of risk management and how it changed from the 70s through the period right before the financial crisis, and who the players were in terms of trying to develop the ideas and how it worked its way into the public policy arena. So it's not looking at some specific individual. It's looking at how these networks involved with a specific problem might have emerged, changed, what the relationships are among them. And you can apply that sort of setup to so many different topics. I know that, for example, 2 or 3 different attempts to look at funding of programs like your program here or my program would be obvious things to look at. But the ones that I have in mind are how did public choice emerge, moving from Virginia to VPI to GMU.
Yeah, it's a
what were the
story.
various steps involved? Who were the personalities? What were the links back and forth that allowed things to work in some places and not work so well in others? I mean, this is all part of the history of institution building, and those institutions are what give us the current reality that we're experiencing. Yeah. So, I mean, people say, why do you want to do that? Well, how did we get to where we are? It's not like this was a linear, predetermined thing. It was fraught with contingencies that had things been a little bit this way or a little bit that way, would be living in a very different world. So it's a way to understand better where we are today through understanding how we.
Yeah, I think about that a lot of these different. We can't understand the unrealized paths of things, right? So we never. Right. But I think about it a lot because even in your own career, if you step this way versus that way, if you write this paper or that paper, and so it's and then what were the reasons why you did one thing rather than the other? It's kind of fascinating. So I want to go back to your own sort of work. And you have talked about this before, but if you could talk about how you found your way to Hayek and to the Austrians through your history of economic explorations as a student, coming out of undergraduate school into graduate school, and then as a young scholar.
Sure. So I enjoyed my undergraduate economics curriculum. I thought that economics was a way to really understand the world in a way that
was at William and Mary.
That was at William and Mary,
yeah.
Exactly right. And I went to graduate school in the 70s at UNC, Chapel Hill. I now teach at Duke, so you can imagine how that nobody trusts me, basically. But anyway, I didn't
You have
much.
both colors on today. We're not on video, but Bruce is wearing
Just in
the
case.
North Carolina shirt, the powder blue, and then the Duke Navy.
I try to pass no matter where I am. I try to pass, but I really didn't see the point of a lot of the classes that I took in grad school. Now, I liked many of my professors, not all of them to be sure, but many of them. But it was a period in which theory was dominant, in which the econometrics was pretty primitive, certainly by today's standards, and I just didn't feel it connected with the world in a way that I thought it did. Certainly, as an undergraduate, I felt it had, but the stuff we were getting in grad school, the professors were not trying to connect it. They were involved in their own research, and they weren't trying to translate it. And when I would ask about this, they would look at me like I was from Mars. So I realized I wasn't really fitting in. And then I came to realize that there was a literature called the philosophy of science and another literature called the methodology of economics. So the methodology of economics was supposed to tell you how to do economics scientifically, and it had people like Samuelson and Friedman and Lionel Robbins and Hayek and Fritz Machlup. There's a list of people who had written on doing economics scientifically. And then the philosophy of science, I thought naively, was just going to tell you how to do science, no matter what the science was, give you the keys to the kingdom in terms of understanding how to do science. And indeed, the philosophy of science that was dominant through the first half of the 20th century was some variant of positivism, which had its origins in the 19th century with Auguste Comte. By the way, a wonderful line about Auguste Comte and his approach to the hierarchies of the sciences. One of his critics said, Comte's approach is like Catholicism without Christ, which is to say all just hierarchy, no religion, just a mindless hierarchy. Anyway, just a point to make. Logical positivism of the Vienna Circle, logical empiricism in the 40s and the 50s. These are the ways that positivism developed through the 20th century, early 20th century, mid-20th century. And then by the 1970s, it had gone by the wayside. And most philosophers of science had said, well, it collapsed under its own weight. There was real problems with it. Now, the positivist worldview, however, still was quite influential in terms of many of the social sciences and particularly in economics. So economists, when they wrote about how to do economics scientifically, sometimes they didn't make reference to any philosophical literature, but when they did, it was to positivism. And it's because positivism was portraying itself as laying out criteria by which you would be able to identify whether something was truly scientific. Rules as to theory choice, criteria of theory choice that they would try to articulate and say, okay, if a theory meets these criteria, then it is scientific. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Well, all that kind of went by the wayside by the 70s. Thomas Kuhn, Imre Lakatos, P.K. Feyerabend, Karl Popper, all had challenged that vision of science. And for those of the listeners who might know about Thomas Kuhn, he said, what you have is a paradigm that emerges, then problems are found within the paradigm, problem areas, and ultimately a new paradigm emerges. The old paradigm doesn't go away very quickly because you have to wait for the people who used to work in it to die off because they often are people who had power. But the new paradigm allows you to see the world in a totally different way. And this Kuhnian structure of scientific revolutions was talking about the physical sciences, not even talking about the social sciences. So you could imagine how even more applicable it might be to something like the social sciences. Well, anyway, it was through these readings about methodology, realizing that many of the methods that economists, or many of the arguments that economists would have been using to try to justify the way they did economics didn't really make too much sense. Trying to figure out that sort of, trying to figure out why economics was looking the way it did I didn't get too much help from the philosophy of science, but I started to say, well, maybe there's alternative ways of thinking about how to do economics. And people who talked about alternative ways, heterodox schools like the Austrians or neo-Keynesians or post-Keynesians, they were often very articulate about methodological problems. So given what I had studied, I found it congenial to see what they had to say. It was through that kind of convoluted path that I came to Hayek, but not so convoluted once I started to learn the history. Okay, that methodological work was very much looking at texts and trying to figure out how they related to each other. With the going to the Austrians, I was saying, well, they're in Vienna. Wait a second. Hayek is interacting with Otto Neurath. Otto Neurath was part of the Vienna Circle. It was somebody that von Mises and Hayek both reacted against when they met him. So there's an historical context to many of these ideas. Hayek was somebody I found positivism uninspiring. Well, Hayek was saying, in reaction to positivism, and Mises was reacting to positivism, saying, this is scientism. This is pretend science. This isn't really the scientific way to approach social phenomena or understanding of social phenomena. Mm. So I was certainly set up to find the Austrian economics approach congenial because they were complaining about approaches to science that I had experienced myself when I was in grad school.
So so early on, I would say, sort of this is all comes out in the Beyond Positivism book. But in the beginning of your career, let's say the first decade, you're making very strong, detailed studies of Mises and critical appraisal, and then also the interaction with Hayek's transformation, and you're sort of tussling with Hutchins and stuff. I mean, is that how did the evolution go from coming upon this sort of strange idea of praxeology and then wrestling with that and then seeing how Hayek sort of might have broke from that but continued the sort of same kind of tradition in some weird way but not in a certain way? Or is it backward? I mean, what's the relationship between Mises and Hayek in your own intellectual development? Can you reconstruct that? Or
Sure. Almost precisely reconstructed, because I went to NYU for a one-year postdoc, 1981-82. And while I was there, I was completing Beyond Positivism, the book that you mentioned, which was my first book, and it was about economic methodology in the 20th century and looking at the philosophy of science and then looking at the methodological arguments. Certainly being at NYU during that year made me much more aware of the arguments of the Austrians, and you'll see that in Beyond Positivism. It shows up in some of the chapters looking at the methodology of economics. And towards the end of my time there, Jerry O'Driscoll, who was on faculty at NYU at the time, gave me something that Terence Hutchison, who you mentioned, had written, talking about how Hayek had changed. There was a Hayek 1 and a Hayek 2. Hayek 1 was under the influence of Mises. Hayek 2 was under the influence of Popper. Hutchison was someone who helped introduce Popperian ideas to the methodological literature in economics. So he was pro-Popper and anti-Mises. And I'm looking at this, and I had certainly studied Mises some over the course of the year. I had studied Popper a lot because of my dissertation, which was becoming Beyond Positivism. And Mises and Popper, I thought, took two radically different approaches to methodology. Now, there have been some people who've argued that they're not as far apart as they might first appear, but usually a priorism versus the importance of testing, that really is getting at two different ways of thinking about how to do science. And yet Hayek was supposed to have been great friends, and he was in fact great friends with both of them. So what's going on with this? Who is this guy who's trying to blend together these two apparently incompatible views? So it was actually working on that problem and trying to see if I could come up with a better understanding than Hutchison's, because I didn't see Hayek as being so much of an a priorist in his early writings. Hayek himself said that Economics and Knowledge was a gentle rebuke. He viewed it anyway as a gentle rebuke of some of Mises's views on a priorism, and thanked Popper, to be sure, in that Economics and Knowledge. But I didn't think that Hayek had ever become a real Popperian either. But Hayek had said, and this is what stimulated Hutcheson to make the claims that he did, was that he went through some sort of change in the 1930s. And that the change that I postulated, that I think is, I might modify it a little bit now, but I think is basically true, is that he started to move from being a very much of a economic theorist in his own mind, of the type of people who did theory in his day, not mathematics, but doing theoretical economics, to being a more broad social theorist, and that the socialist calculation debate and his work on the knowledge problem started to make him think more about these broader social issues. And so that was the transformation that I saw taking place, rather than a methodological switch from Mises to Popper, which I certainly think is not what is not a good way to describe what happened to him in the 1930s, because he wasn't too much of he wasn't a Misesian, and he didn't become a Popperian. So,
one of the personalities that you mentioned briefly in your, unfortunately for the younger generation, they don't get access to him as much in these discussions, is Ludwig Lochmann. But Ludwig Lochmann played a major role in the advancement of the intellectual life of Austrian economists during the 1980s until his death in 89 or 90, I guess. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk very briefly about Lochmann, the power of his mind, and why he was important to young scholars like yourself. Because even when you were at NYU, he was retired from Waterstand, and he was pretty elderly at that time. But yet he had this sort of important influence on yourself and Mario Rizzo and several other people.
So Ludwig Lochmann would come to NYU every spring from South Africa. So he would come to New York in the middle of winter and leave South Africa in the middle of summer. That already shows you the sort of commitment this guy had. And I was there, as I said, 81, 82. So January of 1982, he shows up at the NYU Austrian seminar. And it is a discussion of how quickly prices return to equilibrium. It was a paper that was looking at that. And at some point I put up my hand and I said, well, I don't think you can say anything a priori about that. It's an empirical issue that depends on the particular type of market that you're looking at. And he looked over at me, and he looked like he was slightly nodding his head, which I thought was nice. So then as we're leaving the seminar room, he walks up to me and says, so how shall we begin? And I said, Professor Lochmann, I'm not sure. He says, my office, 10 o'clock Friday morning. And so I went to his office at 10 o'clock on Friday, and from 10 till noon, we sat and talked, and he asked about my interest. And over the course of the conversation, as many people will tell you this part of the story, he would identify articles and say, yes, Piero Sraffa, Economic Journal, volume 37, number 2, 1932, pages 67 to 74. Have a look at that. And you'd write it down. It would be exactly right. He had this committed to memory. I mean, his memory was just completely photographic. He'd come up with 6 or 7 of these things. I'd go off that week. I'd read the stuff. I'd come back to his office. We'd have a discussion. He'd give me another 6 or 7 articles. And we did this for the rest of the semester. Absolutely a gem, just a model of an academic mentor who took this young kid who didn't know anything. I didn't know his views. I later realized that some of these things that I was spouting that I thought were so interesting and insightful, he was saying these things 40 years before in letters that I would come across later. So he would never say, well, of course, that's what I said, or this is my take on it. He just, very interesting. And he would just lead me along in a way that he was just a superb individual to interact with. And he made the time that I was at NYU special. The seminar obviously was the high point of the week, and Israel Kirzner was the person who invited me there and was ran the seminar in a stellar style. But Lockman was what made the whole NYU experience really special. And I went back a couple of times to give papers at the workshop, and would always have a little time in his office again. And just a warm, but sharp mind individual who was trying to stimulate a younger scholar to become interested in the area. And as we are now learning, I mean, he and Kirzner quite self-consciously were trying to build a movement. So they were involved in this enterprise together, and they tip our hats to him. Very successful, I would say. In the end.
So an offshoot of that, actually following up on that, was the program that was established here at George Mason University.
Yeah.
So Rich Fink and Don Lavoie, and through the initiatives with Karen Vaughn, they helped move the Center for the Study of Market Processes from Rutgers Newark to George Mason University in the early 80s. And then Jim Buchanan and his crowd moved from Virginia Tech to George Mason in the early 80s, and they formed a new PhD program. And I'm pretty sure that you were one of the early, you were invited pretty regularly to come through here and give papers with Don's workshop. Don ran the Austrian workshop here and whatnot. So you've seen the evolution of this place over, and you have a lot of colleagues here, David Levy, who's also a historian of thought you've known. You mentioned Sandy before. He's a co-author with David. So, do you have a variety of impressions of something that you've experienced over, well, we won't mention how long now, but through your career, several years, and the ebbs and flows of a program here, because Don Lavoie, unfortunately, was someone who passed away at a young age, but at one time he's a contemporary, roughly, of yours, and was also interested in history of ideas and whatnot. So maybe if you could.
Well, one of my fondest memories was when Don invited me up, and I was giving a paper. And was challenged by 3 young grad students who came up afterwards. And it was, of course, Betke, Pritchitko, and Horwitz. And it was like tag team. And you had, I believe, just completed the paper on equilibrium. Was that
probably. Yeah.
Which I read and thought, this is great stuff. Don Lavoie, he's gotten some great students, and they're doing good stuff. So I have been always hoping to get invitations to come here, and whenever I get them, I jump on them. And I think I'll just say that I walked into the center that you've got here the first time last semester, and now I'm up again. And this time I had the presence of mind to pull out my phone and take some pictures, because I go back to Duke and try to explain exactly what's going on up here, and they don't believe me. It's just a wonderful physical space. You've got so many students. You've got these various programs that are bringing people in from other places, that are bringing people in to the PhD program, the GMU PhD program that is affiliated with the Austrian group. So I just think you're doing marvelous stuff here. And one of the things I should say is there is a kind of a learning curve that I think both of us have experienced. So when I was trying to design what we were doing at the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke, I thought about the best and worst parts of the times that I'd been on research leave, which had been to LSE, to Cambridge for a semester in Cambridge, England, and then NYU. And, some places did have physical spaces. NYU didn't really have a place that you could get together, but they had physical places at at Cambridge, where you could gather. And so I wanted to take the best parts of each one of the experiences and put them together in a center. And I can see that you've consciously really done something like that here, because the available places for interaction and the interactions that are obviously taking place are.
That is a very big part of it. There was an article written by Harry Johnson many years ago that talked about the importance of the architecture of intellectual space, and it compares his experience at Chicago, LSE, and at Harvard. And his argument for why Chicago was so much more productive than all the other environments, even though obviously there's brilliant people in all those different places, is that because they were all located in Hyde Park and they were had to go there, and there wasn't really much to do outside, and they wanted to be inside the university because they didn't want to venture too far out.
Right.
That they ended up bumping into each other all the time, so they had to be doing work. Whereas if you're in London, you're enjoying the city. There's all kinds of other things rather than doing intellectual life. And so Fairfax is not London or New York City or whatever, but that's not the main draw here. It was we were trying to do. I had the fortune to go and teach at New York University in the 90s from 90 to 98. And one of the things that always struck me is when I went up there, people always told the story about Roger Garrison when he was a postdoc, and Kerzner asked him once, Roger, how can we improve the postdoc program? And Garrison said, make it non-residential. And so that wasn't really the way to, go forward. We wanted to make sure that we didn't have that. And we wanted to try to create, as you said, that. And so in that sense, it's more like the way Hoover had the commons area, and we wanted to look for that kind of stuff. But so I appreciate you saying that. But so one last question: is there a book that you've read or something over the last year that you would advise to young people to read that really sort of got you excited? It could be in economics or history of ideas or anything that you just think is a great example of curiosity, learning, and everything that you've been reading.
Well, a lot of what I am reading for a long time has been very much oriented towards the research that I'm doing. So I'm reading mostly old books from the 30s and 40s. So one of them is The Good Society by Walter Lippmann. And The Method of Freedom, which was a series of lectures that he gave before he wrote The Good Society, lectures at Harvard. He was a superb writer. I mean, this is the guy who Hayek met at the Lippmann colloquium, and that's when Hayek started this abuse of reason project. As in some ways, although he had been thinking about it before, I think Lippmann's work actually gave him the impetus to start the project. Well, so did this beginning of World War II, actually. Right. That was a real impetus. But I mean, just to see somebody who, as a famous newspaperman that everybody read every morning in the United States, talking about these same issues that Hayek was interested in, that was actually a very good and persuasive read. I mean, in some ways, it's a pre-Road to Serfdom written in a way that is actually perhaps a little less dry and just more thrilling. You mentioned earlier Keynes's Skidelsky's Keynes. I've been reading chapters of that too, and I find that to be inspirational in terms of just being able to
what you're trying to match and stuff.
I mean that it is really an exemplar of a beautifully written biography that captures the personalities at the same time capturing the ideas. A little less, probably more about the personalities and the place than the ideas, because he's an historian, not a statistician or an economist. But Keynes was such a full figure that he deserved and he got the right biographer, I would say.
Yeah. Any last words of advice to young people about how to pursue a career if they're slightly out of sync in economics?
Yeah.
And,
there are so many ways to do economics and not do economics the way it's done across the board at every other, plain vanilla economics at various sorts of places. So come to GMU, come to Duke.
Yeah.
There's some advice.
Yeah, that is. And have fun what you're doing, right?
Have fun what you're doing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you're not having fun what you're doing, you're going to be doing it for the rest of your life. You might want to rethink that decision.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bruce.
My pleasure. Great to see you, Pete.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.